Session of the morning on the not, untopical issue of consent. Susan, who's with you? Are you on your own or? Graeme, I wondered where you were. I haven't seen you. Morning, Graeme, Laurie.
Good morning, everybody. We'll try to be brief. Now, the bad news about this final session is being delivered by two lawyers. Sorry about that. The good news, hopefully, is that we're going to try to address exactly that last question that was posed. So on the back of all those wonderful examples we've already seen about what kind of work is going on, the kind of sharing that's actually taking place, what else can the Global Alliance actually offer you? Because you might be sitting there saying, well, that's fine for them, they've got their act together, but I'm not nearly at that stage, or I'm not quite sure where to begin. So what we want to do in our session, very briefly, is to give some examples on privacy and security policy that have been developed and in consent policy. I'll do privacy and security, and Susan will do consent. And these are some examples of how to achieve the implementation that Ewan and Peter spoke about earlier on, moving from the abstract to the very specific. And I suppose in one way you could think about our contribution as offering some examples of the interoperability of the human practices that need to occur to drive the Global Alliance, because at the end of the day it's about people doing the work and taking robust, ethical and appropriate decisions. So I'm just going to remind you of the background to the entire alliance, which is the framework. The framework was developed and put into the public domain in 2014 after considerable engagement, and it takes a harmonizing and a human rights-based approach. And in particular, it focuses on Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees the right of every individual in the world to share in scientific advancement, while at the same time giving recognition to people who do the science, who do the work, and recognition of their authorship. So it's about trying to sort of strike this particular balance there in human rights terms, grounded very much in that rights basis. What the framework does is to lay down 4 foundational principles that guide everything that we're trying to do in the Alliance. And you can see them there. Respect for individuals, families, and communities, advanced research and scientific knowledge, promote health and well-being, as well as fair distribution of benefits. That's to patients as well as to the scientific community itself, while also fostering trust, integrity, and reciprocity. The framework is determinedly a high-level document. It lays out those principles as a starting point for deliberation and action, and it identifies a further 10 core elements for responsible sharing. But the question then is, well, how do you do it in practice? How do you go from that high level to implementation? And the answer is through policies. And what we want to offer you are these 2 examples of the policies that have been developed up until now, and their function is really to be facilitative and to operationalize the principles, to put some flesh on the bones, if you like, about what those principles mean in the context of privacy and security and in the context of obtaining consent. So, in terms of privacy and security policy, the task team of which I've got the privilege of chairing was established in October 2014. Over those 9 months, we've had 4 teleconferences, 7 different drafts, and innumerable email exchanges. It also went out to public consultation, and many thanks to anybody in the room who inputted to that. At the end of the day, we had 35 separate inputs on the basis of all of that interaction. We think we now have a very robust privacy and security policy. Its role is the following. First of all, it takes a best practice example approach. It tries to highlight for people sitting there thinking, what do I need to do about privacy and security? It illustrates what you can and ought to be doing through best practices which promote privacy while also advocating and promoting the science and also the appropriate sharing. The policy arguably operates also as a framework for mutual recognition and trust. If different actors are operating with respect to the same policy, you can recognize each other, you can recognize the standards that you're applying, you can also then speak the same language, and that's particularly important in generating and promoting trust between members, between users, and also, of course, crucially, for data donors themselves. And ultimately, and I'll come back to this in due course, it acts as a benchmark, we think, for establishing where are you? Where are you in terms of your development of privacy and security protocols? What else needs to be done in terms of effective sharing? How do you monitor that over time? And what are your unmet needs? And if those unmet needs are identified, then you can come back to the Alliance, and the Alliance can help you to address them. So the objective overall is that through adoption and implementation of the policy, we want to make compatible the levels of privacy and security applied to data across the Alliance to the greatest extent possible. That's the overarching objective. And the approach that the policy takes for privacy and security is by supporting people to execute effective management of certain key issues. And these are the main ones here. The expectations of privacy of people with respect to privacy and security. We know that privacy is not an absolute. We should never strive to obtain that. And we should never give people the impression that that is the standard. That's not what goes on. So how do you manage people's expectations accordingly? What about the risks involved? These are not just risks to privacy, they can also be reputational risks to your own organization. You need to take those into account. It's also about ensuring that you're not offering inappropriate access, and it's also being alert to and responding to likely unethical, illegal, or inappropriate conduct. But you might be sitting there asking, well, how does that necessarily apply to me? Does it apply to me? Who is the audience for this privacy and security policy? And that vexed the task group. And that's one of the reasons why we distinguish in the policy between privacy and security. There are different best practices depending on whether you're talking primarily about privacy or whether you're talking about security. Now, the two obviously overlap, but they're distinct in the ways that this slide tries to highlight. So, for example, privacy is a fundamental human value. It's enshrined in laws and is the basis of rights and responsibilities. It primarily affects individuals, families, and communities, but it's not an absolute. You can share and use data in the public interest and in other ways. Contrast that with security, which is largely about practical measures to manage risks, about sensitivity, quality, and integrity, standards, etc. So therefore, different actors are involved in its management. So the policy addresses its best practice suggestions to different actors, and it's incumbent on anybody using the policy to identify who those relevant actors are. Now, because I'm conscious of time, I'm not going to go through the best practices, but here are just some examples of how we've teased out at a certain level of detail the kinds of best practices that people should be paying attention to. So, for example, with privacy, you'll see it's largely focusing on the data donor, their consent, their privacy, how it affects them, their families, their communities. Security, it's much more about the technical side of things. There's the need to identify a security officer as an instance of best practice, and attention should be paid equally to physical as well as technical measures that are in operation. If you find yourself deficient in any of those areas, then the Alliance is there to actually help you manage that. So where now we've got a policy, is it a document that's going to sit there or can it actually be put to valuable use? Well, yes, of course it can. The expectation is this policy will be used by all entities and individuals who are involved in providing, storing, accessing, managing, or otherwise using data. Of course it applies to members, but it's also any other entities beyond that, because we see this as a global gold standard. And the expectation is that all reasonable steps should be taken to implement the policy. At the end of the day, if you ask yourself, where's its added value, we think there's at least 5 different ways in which this policy could be used by you. First of all, it might simply be a pure endorsement that, yes, we recognize this as a gold standard, even if we don't yet meet it ourselves. Secondly, there should be a move, or there could be a move to implement it as far as is possible, but we're not seeing this as a prescriptive, top-down imposed issue. The Alliance doesn't have the authority to do that. It's much more about supporting people through the processes. So that's why the other 3 elements come in, because it can act as a maturity model. In other words, it can act as a model to help you assess your readiness for sharing that meet the objectives and the aspirations of the Alliance more generally. And also over time, as you get geared up and as other people are interested in working with you, it can act as a benchmark to determine ongoing preparedness for responsible sharing. So it's something that can actually be of value, not just now, but also in the future. And importantly, in terms of the work that you might do with the Alliance, it's a starting point to co-produce new tools and support for the community. That goes back to what Peter was saying about the vision for these tools in due course. So if you used it and identified certain unmet needs, then that's the point where you can begin dialogue and cooperation with other members in the Alliance. I'd just like to say thank you very much to the task team. It seems now that our work for privacy and security is complete. It couldn't have happened without this incredibly diverse range of actors, and this actually very much reflects the membership of the Regulation and Ethics Working Group, which has made a real effort to try and be global in its reach, going back to what Peter and Ewan were suggesting needs to happen earlier on. The one thing I would say just before I pass on to Susan is we really could not have done our work without Ted Dove, who is the coordinator for the Regulation and Ethics Working Group. Ted has worked very closely with us on privacy and security, and he's worked with Susan on consent, it wouldn't have happened, or at least we wouldn't have got to this stage as quickly as we have, and we're very, very grateful to Ted for him, and to you for your patience. Thank you.
Some nice young man's going to come and move this, I know, but I'll. Thank you, Graeme, for introduction. I'm going to start off by also thanking Ted, because that was my last note to myself. Said I wouldn't be up here. See, I knew you'd be here. Thank you. Cheers. Thank you. Just briefly on the consent policy, our group, and I'm not. That's it. Our consent task team began March 2014 when we were meeting in London at the first G4GH plenary meeting. And our first task, we've had two tasks. Our first task was the preparation of some consent tools. This project was led by Anne-Marie Tassé and the P3G IPAC. As Heidi mentioned, this is the research template information, consent form, consent language that is for use for people. It's up on the G4, on the Alliance website at the moment. It is a bit paper-based, and we acknowledge that, but there are a lot of us that are working still with paper, and we hope the language will continue to be useful to people. Our second task was our consent policy. If you read the framework, which I hope you will, it states there that the use of data, that the framework applies to the use of data that has been consented to by donors or their legal representatives, and or approved for use by competent authorities or institutions. We took that as our starting point for the consent policy. This policy does not override any existing consent that has been gained from a data donor, but it seeks to facilitate onward data sharing, onward sharing of that data under the framework, under the Alliance. So we also hope that it helps in designing prospective consent. So if you are looking at a new project, by providing information that will help you draw up your consents. It does not focus, as our limitations section, it doesn't focus on the return of health-related findings, and it doesn't talk about individuals' rights to access their own health-related data. Those are two big topics, probably deserve their own task teams, so we left that out of this policy. There's certainly issues that need to be discussed. So the basic principles underlining the consent policy are that consent is ideally an open, communicative, and continuing process. That in this discussion, that there is an intention to share data across clinical research groups or jurisdictions, national boundaries, with appropriate approvals in place. That the plans for data sharing should be transparent, understandable, and accessible. Data donors have a right to not participate. They have a right to withdraw, understanding, of course, that once data is shared, it can't be drawn back. But that data users and data producers will also abide by applicable regulations and ethical norms when seeking and conducting international data sharing. So these were the basic principles that we started out with to underline where we were going to go forward with the policy. As Graeme mentioned, we've categorized our best practices under the headings within the framework, and I'm presenting a few small examples here, such as under the accountability that consent materials and data sharing policies should be available for inspection and discussion. Excuse me, very basic kind of thing. If somebody wants to know how their data is being shared, they should be able to find out what that consent form, what that data sharing plan says. So, like Graeme also said, we're trying to make consent implementable for onward data sharing. So transparency, it should be transparent in consent discussions and in materials. The data is going to be shared, very basic principle. But if you go through consent forms, and I've seen a lot of consent forms over the years, that basic information may not be there. Or it might be in the form of, we're going to share your data with colleagues, or we're going to share your data with other institutions. And it's a really interesting question of whether that is sufficient consent, but won't get into that now. But so we're just trying to point out or help people to know that these are the kinds of things that need to be examined, need to be part of consent discussions and materials. Risk-benefit analysis as well. Under accessibility and dissemination, we split some of the recommendations under sharing prospective data and sharing legacy data. These are not all of the best practices within each of these categories. These are just examples. But we recognize that sharing legacy data has different issues than prospectively asking for data to share. And certainly with legacy data, we've tried to tease out the steps that one needs to go through or think through. You know, does my consent say I can share the data? If it doesn't, is there a possibility? Can I go to an ethics review committee perhaps? Is it appropriate for this data to be shared? How can we go about doing it, et cetera? So in conclusion, this policy is not intended to cover all aspects of consent to data sharing because that's not possible. It is not designed to replace other policies related to consent because there are a lot of them out there. It's to look at international data sharing. It's not the final policy because we will continue to look at it, revise it, input. As Ted has told me, both our policy and the privacy and security policy are now up on the website and available. Please, we will be reviewing. If you see something, send me an email. And it should not be the end of the discussion for data sharing and consent. The policy is intended to give guidance, and there are consent members of the task team, and others who are there to talk to you about consent. So please, let us know. The consent is bleeding into a lot of the other discussions out there. There are other initiatives. Our task team is going to sleep at the moment, but members are being parts of other groups, and we want to help you and talk about consent if that's appropriate. The machine-readable consent task team is beginning to come together. We had an e-health meeting yesterday, and we were talking about consent with family history data. Very interesting discussion, and so we hope to be helping in that area. Other ideas, Richard Durbin in the UK meeting for the Alliance said to me, consent as an API. Oh, I don't know anything about APIs, being not from that area, but could we, and I talked to John Wilbanks and machine-readable consent, perhaps there's some way of having your consent travel out there. So interesting ideas out there, and said we're very interested in the following in discussions. Said these are the task team members. If I've left you off the list, I do apologize. Thank you to everyone else who commented. Just one thing I'd like to say, which out of the discussions yesterday, consent is not a barrier. It should be part of the discussion. Patients we know want to share, but they also want to be asked. They also want to be part of the discussion. So we hope to work with all of you to make sure that discussion is held. Thank you.
Excellent. A question for either of the last two speakers? You don't have to go anywhere. Mark.
Just in relation to, obviously a lot of people in this room believe in the concept of international data sharing, but how do we get that message out there, and how do we get the message out there that it needs to be thought about in a consent framework in relation to international data sharing? Because I think we'll find that there are a number of initiatives simply haven't thought about the fact, while they might think internally or within a country or within a region in relation to consent, they won't think about it in the international context of data sharing.
You're absolutely right. And even within international consortia, looking at their consent forms, it still says, I'm going to share with an institution. And actually, people want to know that it's international, because some people are very happy with their data staying within their own country, or even in Europe. They're not so happy, perhaps, with it going out and abroad. And that is an issue that, if you look in our policy, we mention that, try and make that specific. We believe in it strongly and try and encourage it as much as possible. And it's something that the Global Alliance really needs to make sure is very clear also. Because you certainly can do a lot of good work within one country, you can do even better work if it's international, but people need to know that's what's happening.
Could I just add to that? I think it's also really important to try to identify what is the culture that's driving a reluctance to share. Is it a culture of caution because people are concerned, for example, that they think it's illegal? Or is it a culture of caution because they think it's their data and it's an ownership issue? Or is it, which it seems to be more likely, is it a culture just of uncertainty because they don't know where to start? And that's where you can then point to these sorts of policies and say, well, for consent or privacy and security, do that assessment of your current standing, and then let's begin the dialogue. But I think understanding what's the culture that's driving it's also important.
That's where education will come in as well.
Yeah, so it's a question for the last two speakers. Basically, I didn't hear a mention of the fact that the EU privacy regulation is in flux and we don't know where it is going. And it might be extremely restrictive. So, you know, this might all be, at least for Europe, all idle talk. I mean, maybe next year we'll just won't be able to do very much. And so I think we need to address this very urgently, and I'd like to wonder what the GA4GH its position is with regard to that.
It seems that nothing's going to happen in terms of fundamental legal change until 2018. That the Dutch, when they take over presidency, are going to try and sort of push things to be more concrete. It looks also, though, as if things are moving in a more encouraging direction towards supporting and facilitating health research. For example, as long as you have a legal basis, now the current proposal, as long as you have a legal basis for health research, then you don't necessarily need consent. That wasn't with the starting position previously. And we also have to remember that major funders like Wellcome and others are actually putting a lot of pressure on trying to make sure that the best possible deal is brokered. So the reason it wasn't mentioned is because, as you say, it is in a state of flux, but my sense is the general direction of travel is quite positive.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think it's been a big conflict, and it might flip around again in the near future. We don't know that.
No, we don't. But all we can continue to do is to keep up the positive pressure, and also use examples like some of those we've heard this morning to illustrate just why the data sharing is valuable, and that privacy is not something that necessarily undermines. You know, the protection of privacy is not something that undermines the value of this kind of public benefit. That's the message.
In the context of that, I want to mention that the Innovative Medicines Initiative, together with a couple of projects, have worked on a code of practice for secondary use of medical data. Here it's public. We're also trying to bring it to the attention of the working parties. 29, we tried to go to the European Data Protection Supervisor, but they said they were not competent to give that advice. It had to go to Working Party 29. So, but that guideline is out and open for everybody, and it uses a couple of the concepts that you talked about. A question: what do you mean by the data donor? Do you mean the data subject?
Broadly, yes. It's the person that provided the data, but we didn't want to use data subject because that's very much a European legal concept, and this is obviously a global initiative, but yes.
Okay.
I was just going to make a related point that I think there's two main sources of this kind of data, which is clinical trials and diagnostic laboratories. And consent looks very different in those contexts. It's hard to see how a person who's just giving blood for a BRCA test is going to dwell too long on the complexities of a 5-page consent form.
That's a very good point. Okay, so great consent policy for data sharing. Thank you for that. But if we look, and we all want to see more data sharing, obviously, but if we look at many of the things going on in Global Alliance, especially the beacons, for example, it's a pure example of not data sharing, but data discovery, where the idea is that you don't necessarily hand over any data, you just discover data. So I'm wondering to what extent your consent policy also applies to data discovery, because as I see it, most consent documents don't even cover the concept of discovery.
I agree, Tony. It does not specifically talk about data discovery. Perhaps it's something that we need to be thinking about, do a separate policy or an addendum or an extra section. I think most data donors probably don't understand the distinction. And so, that needs to be a question of whether, they would react differently to consent for discovery than for sharing. And that's actually an interesting question.
That's a great answer, but I thought you might also say that in many ways discovery is a form of sharing, and so it could be covered by that.
Great, thank you.
Right. I thank absolutely everyone, starting with David and Ewan and right through to the end. That was a fabulous morning. I know we're a bit over time. We will have 20 minutes for coffee, and loud voices will chase you in possibly a little bit earlier than that. And thanks all the participants. Thank you all the audience as well.